Story Time with Stephanie Storey.
Hi, welcome to Story Time. I am art historical novelist Stephanie Storey, and I'm very excited for my guest today. She's a fellow history nerd, and she is the author of the New York Times bestselling book that just came out earlier this year, You Never Forget Your First, a biography of George Washington. She's also the podcast host of No Man's Land, among many other things, which we will get to. We actually first met, if you can call it that, on Twitter, which I will get to. Welcome to the show, Alexis Coe.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. So as I alluded to during my introduction, we met because I posted an article about sort of people giving me a little bit of crap for writing about famous men, because I write about Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo and Raphael. And you retweeted that and suggested that you have a similar experience or story. Can you tell me, have you had a similar experience where either you have felt strange or people have made you feel strange about writing about a famous man like George Washington?
Well, the preface and the introduction to the book are defined by this topic and address it specifically, which is that I was fully aware of a male skew, and when I would go to George Washington symposiums at Mount Vernon, it would be me and, a sea of old white men. But it wasn't until I rearranged my biographies several years into the project in which I realized, oh, man. And I realized that when I separated out microhistories, which are about, let's say, slavery or his marriage or his wife or something like that, those were women, but there were no women in the major biographies. And I thought, oh, I must be wrong. I went down this rabbit hole. I thought my library isn't representative of the world's library. Googling yielded the same results. I emailed Mount Vernon, my contacts there, and sent them down the same slippery slope. And then the University of Virginia, George Washington papers, all sources I was already in constant contact with. And it was one of these things that we all had to really realize, even though it had been so obvious, that I'm the first woman in 4 decades to write a biography of George Washington. And I am the first trained historian. I hold a graduate degree in history to have written a book about him in over 100 years. We sort of stopped counting. It wasn't worth our time. I was like, oh, there's so much work to do. Let's not count these years. And that's not really, I don't say that as it's not a good thing. But there are a lot of reasons. It's not, it's a lonely club, and it's not good for the scholarship. No, and it's not just that women are excluded, it's people of color as well. And when you have one group of people telling the story for generations and generations, they speak to an audience that looks like them. And they also tend to share a worldview, particularly with Washington biographers. They largely come from Virginia. They, tended to grow up around there. If they didn't grow up in Virginia, but they definitely visited Civil War or Revolutionary War sites. So they had this interest in military history and in honor and great men and traditions of Southern gentility that really defined their books. And it was just truly obvious. And much has been made about this in the media, that I am this woman holding this unique position. And there has been some interesting pushback, but for the most part, everyone has to realizes it's ready. And Annette Gordon-Reed and Jeff Rosin's studies has famously shown us this. So I have luckily a really great example to point to. But what I hope is that to say something so clearly, and not to make a big statement or to say look at me, but to say this is a need and this is why, and then to go through painstakingly and point out the errors that they have made because there has been this dominance. I hope that encourages so many more women and people of color to come in, because this is kind of true across the board with presidential history, unless it's someone like Lincoln. Otherwise it's really dominated by white men, and women have to do double duty, right? They have to find women I say this again in the preface, they have to, you know, find women and people of color who were excluded from the narrative. And then they also now, it turns out, have like double duty as usual, and they have to go back and they have to check men's work.
What? It's so true, because I love reading all of the histories about people who have been left out of history. I love them. But I am sort of missing this, but we all need to re-envision the people who did make a big impact because they were allowed to make a big impact because they were white men. What specifically did you find different, looking at it through your perspective and your lens, that other historians you felt like had missed? What light did you get to shine?
Yeah. Well, one, I find if you don't spend so much time marveling over his masculinity, you can save about 300 pages. And so I think one of the things that was really interesting is, I mean, it always comes back to the primary influence, which was his mother. They all paint her to be this like terrible woman. They go, now I have a chart in the beginning of the book where I just list all the things that he called her. Shrew, because we live in a world where a woman is a shrew unless proven otherwise, and even then, I don't know. So we have that, but it was also like, it was so weird to me that they all came down so hard on her before I started researching, when I was just reading their work, and they also would call her things like crusty, like things I would never call a subject in nonfiction. And so one of the things that they kept calling her was illiterate. And I thought, okay, that's weird, because she was a businesswoman. And then, like, I know she wrote a couple letters. One apparently like was quite embarrassing, which, by the way, she never wrote, which they all claim that she did. And so I went and I looked and like immediately saw that they had tons of letters in the archives from Mary Washington to Mary Washington. They are very roughly written. You know, they're not artful. They don't demonstrate the kind of education or leisure time that we would see with someone who was able to read novels, like, let's say, Martha Washington or Abigail Adams, because Mary Washington, Washington's mother, was born to an indentured servant. It's a great American story that, you know, she could be born to an American servant or indentured servant, and then she could give birth to the future president and great liberator of the United States. And they missed that story because they wanted to tie him to a masculine story, which, because his father had died, they decided, like, oh, this woman has a lot of attitude for her time period and for our likings. We're going to sort of describe her this way. We're going to make her the person he has to escape. And then we're going to have him like want to be his half brothers all the time. And it was crazy to me because it wasn't that situation. Like, she could read, she could write, but also Lawrence, his half brother, died when he was 19. Washington benefited greatly from his death. He also, Lawrence was your rich relation. You know, let's say you came from a family that had done well. It's like a tale as old as time. Haven't they read any dark, Victorian novels about young girls who like had to go live with their uncle or their half brother or whoever? And it's that story where it's like, okay, I have to go, pay my dues to Lawrence for the weekend in order to like get a connection, or like, that was just really obvious to me. So it was a lot of like stretching to make something true about like a great man in history who was like destined for the presidency, instead of just like, hey, this is an amazing story that's it's someone who like put in a lot of work to get somewhere. And it's not a perfect story. It's not a perfect story, but a lot of people don't have perfect stories, and that's great. That's American.
Well, right. That's what I started to say. Isn't that going to be interesting as new voices and new perspectives come to these stories that we've heard over and over again? We are going to start getting these other pieces that help us understand them in a better way.
And they're in conversation with each other. Like, my book is, people will say my two favorite Washington books are like Alexis Coe's book and Ron Chernow's book, and I go after him quite a bit. But like, it totally makes sense to me that people would like those two books together. They're perfect complements.
because they're sort of talking back and forth to each other. It is a
Yeah.
conversation about what this history means and where we come from.
And it's exciting for the reader to be like, okay, I don't know, where do I come in on this? And like, I think it's complicated. I'm going to like take a little bit of him and take a little bit of her. And that's fantastic. Like should be many different versions of a book, and there should be many different readers.
Well, we all experience people in a different way, in our own perspective when we meet them in real life. Anybody who meets me, different people have different impressions of me and who I am as a human being. Same for you. I think it should be the same way for history. The other thing that you do that other historians don't do as much, that I love and I want to hear why, is that you bring a little bit of, you've already done it in this conversation, you bring some levity. You don't quite take it so seriously. You bring a little bit of lightness to your history. Why has that been your door into history? Why do you think that's important?
I don't know if it was on purpose. You know, I've always done this. I think I was really excited. I've always been excited by history, obviously. And when I was in graduate school, I was sort of bummed at how difficult it was to both try to be taken seriously as a historian and also to communicate with people. So if you're writing in an academic setting, your writing has to be quite serious. And my writing still is, you know, at the core, the first draft is always like very straightforward and, you know, full of like academic jargon. But I worked as an intern when I was in grad school at the Brooklyn Historical Society. And I sort of like got a sense of public engagement really early on that they don't teach you in grad school. I didn't even really know it existed or how museums function. And then I ended up leaving after my master's, before I was done with my PhD, for the New York Public Library. I worked in the exhibitions department. And I would like watch people watching something I had worked on for years. And it was the most beautiful gift because you don't get to see your readers. You don't get to like get inside your students' heads. But I would see them linger. I would like see them, you know, lean in to read something. I would get a sense of what worked. And then I would imagine like, what do I want them to take away? Like I thought a lot about this. And then when I became a writer shortly thereafter, I brought it to that, which is that whenever I talk to someone, I'm trying to tell them something about history. I realized that I don't want them to know, I don't need them to know every single date or name or circumstance. I want them to think of it as a bite-sized morsel, be really excited to tell someone about it. And in order to do that, like you need to make it seem really easy. And anything that seems that easy takes so much mastery. That is just absolutely true. Yeah. And so, I mean, as anyone knows. And so I think what I try to do is be honest about my research experience, which is I throw myself into it, but you don't do this unless you love something. And what do you do when you love something? You like your dog or your husband or your baby or whoever, like you kind of make fun of them, right? You have some fun with them. And that's what I think it's both of those things, both like an ardent desire to get people excited and to see and to have studied how they interact with history and with my work, and also to feel genuine affection for it. And to me, someone like Washington is very much alive to me. And so I can be like, oh, he's being so ridiculous, but it's fine. He's just having a bad day. And that's like a way of talking about him that's responsible, actually, because I'm not like, oh, I must defend him and say that like he was perfect, which nobody is. And I'm not saying like, burn him down, he was the worst, you know. And I think that's really important. The levity, I think, is sort of tied to sort of a tangential issue in academic and or in nonfiction in general and in presidential studies, which is this tendency, which I've already sort of implied, and which is to be reverent, right? To say like, this person we're studying because they're going to be a role model for the nation. We're not studying them for that reason. We are studying them because they're historically significant. And that's why we know about them. If you want to declare George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, I would go more the Ben Franklin route, but like whoever you want to declare as your role model, that's fine, but that's a personal decision, right? That's a decision you make in your own home. That's not why he's in our textbooks. And so to me, instead of saying we should be reverent and respectful to the founders or to whomever, I ask, like, why do we accept reverence? Because if you're reverent, you're biased. You're protecting someone, you've got an agenda. A reverence doesn't necessarily mean disrespect or that you don't take something seriously. It means that you're looking at it almost clinically, right? You're looking at it as you would. And that's what we expect from the sciences. We expect that from doctors, from trials. And I think we should expect that from historians as well. And you can still be passionate with that, but like, you can't want to marry your subject. That's a different thing.
You can't leave them up on a pedestal like that, you know?
Yeah, and you don't have to knock them down either. That's the funny thing is, there's a very small, but I would say persistent group of academics, like 4 or 5, who feel like their books haven't gotten enough attention. And they often say, like, I tore him down, or like, like, F you, George Washington. That's like literally not at all what the book is about or what any review has ever said. And these people obviously also say they haven't read the book, which I find amazing for anyone to admit. But there's a little bit of, it's hard when someone takes up a lot of air in the room, and I totally get that. But there is, there's room for everyone. Again, like, there's room for everyone. And if you don't have to knock someone down. It doesn't have to be negative. It just does not have to be deferential. Those are very different things. And I think that everyone should be able to handle that spectrum, that range.
A human out of the person doesn't have to be up in the attic or down in the basement.
No, but the impulse is curious, isn't it? It's
okay.
Like, what are you worried about? And I think they're worried that, like, he'll be canceled. But what I say is, like, he can't be, so it's not a concern. Like, I'm not worried about him. And I don't think they should be. No one is. It's not disrespectful to say he was a bad slave owner. He fought brilliantly for a democracy for a small group of people, or a large group of people, but not all the people. Only men, only white men. And that's just a fact. And that's okay. That's okay. We can talk about it, because people are not one thing. And certainly he wasn't. We know that because he held all these great offices, and he also held terrible ones.
The way you talk about wanting to take this like bite-sized thing and make this person human and make us sort of understand this small moment and get into the story, and you don't need to communicate every single detail, sounds to me a little bit like a historical novelist. It's probably my bias. I know you're a trained historian. Have you ever thought about writing a fictional version of these things, or are you totally a nonfiction person and that would never cross your mind? Because you have to daydream about the life in a way that...
Yeah. There are certainly times, not with someone like Washington, when there's a lot of primary sources, I always feel like, oh, how will I even get through all of this, but when there's, there have been so many times with women in history in particular, where the trail runs cold, and I know I can't write a nonfiction book about them. But I would love to write something, and I have thought about it, but I don't know. It's sort of like, maybe I'll do it one day, but I have no immediate plans. And that's usually because I have so many projects I'm just trying to get to the end of, but I certainly wouldn't be against it. And I think it's a lot of fun. I read a book about, reimagining, like, what if George Washington had not been, if he had said, like, okay, I'll be king instead of being president. And it was a romance novel. I thought it was like a good fun. It was not very tied to his life. It was sort of like a jumping off point, and there were just like a few callbacks. But the Mount Vernon was the palace, in which I thought was pretty funny. But it was totally fun, but it wasn't really based on it. So then I think I was because it was a direct translation, I was sort of thinking, oh God, you have to make so much stuff up, like a Secret Service man named Connor, which it was like,
I have to write
but in its own way. But I have seen the translations. I worked on the George Washington series on the History Channel with Doris Kearns Goodwin, and I was in the writer's room watching them think through things and saying like, no, you can't possibly do that, or like, I don't know, that's cool, you can go with that. Mm-hmm. And then my first book is being adapted, and I've gotten a front row seat to that. It's being done by Jennifer Kent, who directed The Babadook. Mm-hmm. And I've loved seeing what she's done with the book, and sort of, it's so smart, you know, it's really, but it's based on my book, so it's based on research. So I think that would be another thing, is sort of finding a good, there would have to be enough there, I guess, this was a very long answer of saying like, I need a certain amount of facts in order to get there, if I were to get there. But I am certainly open to it. And I do think it's a wonderful way to, because I do think nonfiction sort of always finishes the job, but I do think it's a good, it's a really necessary placeholder in some instances where there are all these women and it's like, there's just not a lot there. Like, why not just try and make their names known as a placeholder? And hopefully then if there was like, if there was like a very successful book on a totally unknown woman, some historian would come along and be like, I wonder if that's true. And then boom, it happens.
That's right.
So
that's right.
Everybody wins.
Hey, that's right. That's what I think. Now, wait, I have to go back and clarify two things. One, you said it's being adapted. For my viewers at home who are not in the television film industry, it is being adapted into a movie. It is Alice and Frida Forever. It was about a famous murder in Memphis, right? And these were two young women who were
19 and 17, and it was front page news at the time, and then totally forgotten after the day the murderess Alice Mitchell gets sent to the asylum for murder, because she said her motivation was because she loved her same-sex lover. So it was really well known and then forgotten, and I found it like in a footnote in a very dense academic text, and tried to get other people to write about it for years, and nobody would, so then I did. And it was really hard to put together because there were limited primary sources, but I spent years kind of like quietly working on it, and then hoping to like give the research to someone else, and then I did it. And it was optioned, and it's happening, and Amazon is funding it, and that means that basically the book was bought, and then a very talented screenwriter who I luckily got to pick, and producer and director, are making it into a film. And so I'm a consultant on it, and so I've had this front row seat. And I also took a retreat with Jennifer Kent, the director, and we talked about the girls, and I sort of handed them off to her. And it's incredible, like the choices she made. It's so exciting, and seeing her imagination go wild, and it's responsible. Like it's different than I would have thought, because I'm so married to the story as it is, but it's fun. Like I can see going and really enjoying it. And authors don't usually say that. It's usually a lot of like griping, but it's fantastic. And like, how great, how lucky.
But that's what I started to say. That comes from your attitude of you're taking it as, I got to hand these girls off to somebody else. You seem to come at it from a knowledge that you created one piece of art and they are creating a different piece of art with the movie.
And they belong to the world because I didn't invent them. And that's true with a historical subject. That's true with anything. There's room for everyone to have their go at it. We can all sort of share them. And for me, because it was my story, I just wanted them to be with someone who would treat them well, as well as I treated them, which is just with respect, but looking at them truthfully. And it's another complicated story where there's someone who's not quite a hero and not quite a villain. And so you really need someone who can hold those two things at once. And I feel like I lucked out there.
Okay, but these two things, these two young women who had to go digging, very few primary sources, very little, you had to go figure it all out and piece it all together. Is that why suddenly you jumped to writing about like the most famous man in American history, George Washington? Was it because it was completely different? Like what?
No, I know. How to go from one to the other. It's so funny. So I was working on this podcast, Presidents Are People Too, for Audible. And my research process is a little bit like when I would take an elective in grad school, where I would read 3 to 4 biographies in conversation with each other, because presumably there would be a diversity of opinions, and by the end of it, you would emerge with a good conversation in your head, and decide, who you want to go with, and what you agree with, what you don't. Never happened with George Washington. He was the only one in which I was like, this is so weird. And then I started checking the primary sources. I saw they didn't agree with each other. And I had the same exact feeling that I had with Alice and Frida, which was like, oh no, if I don't do this, if I don't tell people what I see here, because I do see something specific, and I do have a sort of unique eye. It's not just that. I think the levity thing is like an interesting recent thing. But I do sort of, the reason I'm able to do these things, I've had the career that I have, is like, I see certain things. And so when I did that, I thought, if I don't fix this, I'm sort of complicit in this story that keeps getting perpetuated or not perpetuated in Alice and Frida's case. And I just like have to do it. But at their core, they're both political histories, even though they seem to be about different things. Alice and Frida is really about America at the turn of the century, after the Civil War, before World War I. It's about gender roles, it's about the South and the North, and tension between white and Black America, and a lot of things that, and justice, and that runs throughout all of my work. And those same themes of like justice, gender, America, change, progress, those are true for George Washington too.
Okay. One last question.
Yes.
Because I have 800 questions for you, but I'm going to ask one last one. How is the pandemic treating your writing and your creativity and or your promotions of, because I know this book just came out in February, so you were in the middle of doing PR, just like all of us were. Books come out this spring.
Yeah.
But how has this been treating primarily your writing and your creativity?
I had 3 great weeks. 3 great weeks. It was like amazing. It was like so much press. It was like everywhere. And I did a nationwide tour, and then I had this, and it was like the Times, the New York bestseller list. And then I had this pause between dates, and then it was like, oh, that's getting canceled. It all happened in a few hours. It's been strange because I'm like trying to still do things. The archives are closed, so it's sort of difficult for me to check on a lot of the things that I had been planning on looking into in the spring. And it's difficult because, of course, we're in quarantine and we're on week 7, and actually we have it. The baby, I have a baby who's 10 months old, and she has it. She was just diagnosed, and she's been sick for about a week. And I think maybe I had it a couple weeks ago. Same with my husband, and we're sort of like having like lingering symptoms. So I would say that it's been a complete experience, but we have had pretty mild symptoms in comparison to a lot of people. The baby's had a really consistent 100-degree temp for like 6 days, but it hasn't gone higher, which is great. And she seems fine. She's like the happiest baby in the world. So it's really actually hard to tell she's even sick unless you take her temp. And I've been all over the place. So, but nothing that bad. We are not the stories you read about, which I think is really interesting because the symptoms aren't totally consistent, and the way that they've rolled out haven't been totally consistent, which just shows you that we need to stay home and take care of ourselves, and that cleaning materials are not the thing to put in your body. That we all know.
Good. Yes. No.
Yeah.
That should not happen. Okay. If you guys have it, then this whole pandemic, even if you went through it mild, this whole pandemic is definitely going to change the way you view history, no doubt. And will no doubt, when you come on the other side of it, you will have a new perspective in some way, I'm sure.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting as a historian to live through it and to have, to realize some of the things that I've read about. Certainly I now have a personal experience with, and some of the deprivation that even a few generations back that we hear from our own family members, that has resonated definitely. And so I think that it will forever influence, life and who we are, and certainly the way I write and study history. It has, yeah, I mean, it's truly incredible. it's hard to see, not just the pandemic, but, and this is, you know, another conversation, but as a political historian who specializes in the presidents, it's very hard to see the country go through something like this without the proper leadership they should have. And for states to be struggling the way they are, because as George Washington said in many letters, and I mention in the book, if we wanted states to be fighting over these sorts of resources and the chaos and competitiveness that the Trump administration has encouraged, then we would have just kept the Articles of Confederation. There's a reason we have a federal government. There's a reason the Constitution was necessary, and I think that that everyone should be registered to vote. That's a good place to end.
And we should all be able to vote from home somehow if we need to this fall. We should all
absolutely. That is that is the patriotic act, no matter what party you are a part of. That is what you should absolutely insist upon, is your right to vote in November. If there is absolutely no reason that we should not.
That's right. I had 800,000 more questions for you, but you were fantastic, and I loved listening to all of it. Now everybody's just going to have to go out and read the book to get more of the brilliant Alexis Coe in their head. And and we all love the virtual background behind you, which is just brilliant. I just had to point out
4 times.
That's right. That was Michelle. Go out in a bookstore. It's brilliant. It's lovely. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you for the work you do for history and politics, and for helping us all understand this world we are living through. You're fantastic. I wish you guys all the best, and I hope your daughter feels better.
Thank you so much. Thanks. Be safe. Be well.
Thank you, guys. Bye. See you next time.
Bye.
Story time virtually. We've got time and plenty of stories, talking stories in a novel way. Story time with Stephanie.